Hello. There are few individuals who have had a profound impact on the nature of modern gaming culture, but my guest today has done exactly that. In the mid 1970s, with his close friends, he founded Games Workshop. Originally intended to sell wooden toys, the company quickly grew to be a gaming institution. From there, he helped Dungeons and Dragons take off in the UK, launched and edited White Dwarf magazine, invested in Citadel Miniatures and Warhammer Fantasy, and wrote the first of many internationally best-selling fighting fantasy game books. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Sir Ian Livingstone. So Ian, thank you so much for joining me and being willing to spend some time chatting about your experience creating Games Workshop and some of the stuff you did to bring that company to life. I wonder if we might start with just talking a little bit about what drove you and your friends to start Games Workshop in the first place.
Well, I went to Altrincham Grammar School in the 60s and met two guys, one called Steve Jackson, one called John Peake, and we kind of common interest of board games and Lambretta scooters and blues music. And we when we left school, we kept in touch, and we all ended up in London, all had pretty boring, badly paid jobs. And we were sharing a flat together and often stayed in playing board games. And the conversations often got around to, why can't we do something a bit more than just play games? And can we somehow build a small business around our love of games? So we put out a newsletter called Owl and Weasel and put it out there. And one of the recipients was a gentleman in the United States called Gary Gygax. And even though we hadn't sent it to him directly, he wrote to us and said, love your little magazine. Here's this new game I've invented. What do you think? And that game was Dungeons and Dragons. And it was in a white box with a very ordinary illustration on the cover. But when you open that box, it opened up your imagination like no game had ever done before, and I don't think any game ever would again. And Steve and I became immediately obsessed with D&D, the first role-playing game where you design a labyrinth of rooms and passageways and populate them with monsters and treasure, and the other players take on the roles of heroes and wizards and clerics and thieves and go on these fantastic interactive journeys of exploration, killing monsters and finding treasure. And it was like theatre on the fly. It was a milestone in gaming history. John was less enamored by D&D. He'd been traditionally making wooden games, which I sold to game shops, but he didn't have any interest in D&D. But nevertheless, we ordered 6 copies, and on the back of that order, we got the exclusive 3-year distribution agreement for the whole of Europe. So that's really how Games Workshop started, as a mail order company in a 3rd floor dingy flat in Shepherd's Bush, West London.
But then that there was like an explosion from that point, it seems like, where you all of a sudden very quickly, I guess, went to running a load of stores, or at least that first store and then other stores. You were doing games conventions, D&D conventions, you were publishing Owl and Weasel and then White Dwarf. How were you able to fit in all of that stuff? It must have taken a superhuman effort to do so much in such a short period of time.
I think you weren't there, so you would have realized it wasn't an immediate success story. It took 3 years before we opened our first shop. There was a glacial speed the way it grew, because we weren't able to borrow any money in those days for a games company. The first year was selling it part-time from our flat, and you see people milling around on the street looking for Games Workshop, because that's what we call the company. And of course there wasn't a shop, so you used to open the window, say, you want workshop up here, mate? And they come upstairs and rummage around the boxes in our living room and go away happy, having bought D&D and a few other supplements and stuff. So this kind of lumbered on for a year until Steve and I decided to go full time. John didn't, so we left the flat. We went to the States, met Gygax and all the fledgling games companies that were starting, signed up a load of them, ordered a load of stock, post them back to my girlfriend of the time's address, because we had nowhere to live, nowhere to operate out of, and no money. So that was a little bit challenging in September 1976. So we went to the bank manager and said, "We've got this great game. It's a role-playing game. You kill monsters," and he looked at you like a dog watching television, had no understanding whatsoever what you were talking about, and asked us to leave. And in fairness, I guess he was right, because we were hardly investor ready. Just all we had was our enthusiasm, nothing else. So we had to live in a van for 3 months, parked outside a small office we'd rented at the back of estate agents for like £10 a week. We joined a local squash club so we could have a shave and a shower in the mornings, and then into our little office doing mail orders till about midnight. So this very small triangular life lasted for 3 months until we were finally able to afford a pretty grotty flat also in Shepherd's Bush. So it was very slow at first. And then we started publishing White Dwarf in 77, and that really kind of raised the profile of Workshop. We opened Citadel Miniatures with Bryan Ansell in Nottingham. It was wholly owned by Workshop. But the pivotal moment was probably April 78, when we opened our first retail store in Hammersmith. And there was a huge queue outside, and we suddenly realized that we were probably onto something. And our passion for games was also being enjoyed by other people who were like us. And so from 78 onwards, that's when it really started to grow.
How did you then, given that it was, or it felt like a sort of really slow process and it was tough from the sound of things, was it just pure passion that drove you to continue working on it? Or did you see the future that might be in Games Workshop?
It was a passion project. We didn't set off to make money. We set off to forge our own destiny around something which we love, which was games, board games, role-playing games, tabletop games, miniatures gaming, any kind of gaming we loved. We didn't love the games that were around from other people at the time, the family board games that were available in toy shops, and we wanted to play something different. And we found out there was lots more people like us and who joined us. And it was just a thing we just wanted to do. And it was, I mean, it sounds a bit corny to say it was living the dream, but we really were.
I mean, it must have been an exciting time as well when you were out in America and seeing all of these other companies that were just getting started, and TSR, of course. What was the sort of feel of that time? Did it have a special sort of vibe?
Well, no one thought it was going to be the phenomenon that Workshop and other companies and role-playing games and board games would become. It was very niche at that time, but we loved the content, so we were mad about it. We didn't realize that ultimately there's so many people would be mad about this kind of gaming. But it was very exciting because it was all happening for the first time. And we probably made tons of mistakes, but we had no competition, so we didn't kind of fall over. And we learned from those mistakes. And, as I say these days, failure is success, work in progress.
Indeed, yeah. And then you did, so once that period of initial sort of the real hard graft had been done, and then I imagine there was still plenty more hard graft to go, but you really did expand into all of these different avenues of creating the community and creating different sort of streams to engage with the community through the events and White Dwarf and stuff like that.
We love games, and we wanted, when we opened our shops, we made sure that we hired people who were like us. We didn't hire traditional retailers. We wanted people to create kind of Games Workshop experience, who knew how to play the games and knew how to paint the figures, and make people feel comfortable when they came into a Games Workshop store. And it was that they were kind of, they'd found somewhere really special, and then they go away and tell their friends about it. This wasn't kind of a marketing ploy. It's just that we enjoyed being with people like us, effectively, so that our staff and our customers all shared a common interest. And so we started opening more stores with the same philosophy. And that's how Workshop really started to fly. And then at the same time, White Dwarf was beginning to build, and Citadel Miniatures becoming more and more important. But there was another pivotal moment in 79, because as I said earlier, we only had a 3-year exclusive distribution agreement for Dungeons and Dragons, at the end of which Gary Gygax contacted us and said he wanted a meeting, came over and suggested or proposed a merger between TSR and Games Workshop. And being kind of young, independent-minded Brits that Steve and I were, we said no to that merger opportunity because we didn't want to spend half our lives in Wisconsin, United States, and we wanted to still forge our own destiny. So we said no, much to his surprise. We remained friends. But he said, well, we'll have to set up TSR UK. And we said, fine. So we remain, of course, the largest distributor of D&D because we offered to our trade customers not just Dungeons and Dragons, but all the other role-playing and board games that you could possibly want in your stores. So from RuneQuest to Traveller to all the fancy games, unlimited stuff, the Judges Guild, supplements, all that we had. So we were kind of a one-stop shop. But we realized that we had, we were vulnerable and that D&D was no longer our exclusive property in the UK. So we set about creating our own content and started with a range of board games and developed some good ones. I mean, Judge Dredd and Talisman and other. We published also other games under license like RuneQuest and Cosmic Encounter and some other great games. But it wasn't really until Warhammer came along that we had a worthy contender to be the IP of the future of Games Workshop, which it does turn out to be. And much as I'd love to claim the crown for creating Warhammer, I really have nothing much to do with it other than to be the publisher. It was the idea was Bryan Ansell, who was the managing director of Citadel. He brought in Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley to develop the idea, which was originally going to be given away free in a set of in mail order packages, but it built on the idea and formed into the first Warhammer game, which came out in 1983 and that sold out very quickly, the 3,000 copies. Version 2 sold out, and then it was all hands on deck to follow up on the success of the initial Warhammer. Of course, the ultimate thing was Warhammer 40k, that came out in 87, I believe. But the whole premise of Bryan was about selling miniature figures. When we were making miniatures for role-playing games, it's kind of ones. You need one wizard and one giant rat and one dragon, but he wanted to sell units. So that's really Warhammer was not an excuse, but it's a reason for people to buy regiments rather than single units figures.
And did that sort of increasing focus and that shift in that direction, what was that like from the sort of business perspective? How did that change the organization that you were running?
Well, there was effectively two companies operating, not independently, but they were joined, part of the family. But in Nottingham, we had Citadel Miniatures and Warhammer, and in London, we had the retail stores and all the board games, distribution, plus our own board games. There wasn't a rivalry. There was definitely a feeling of it's all workshop. But at the same time, Steve and I had become international best-selling authors with the publication of the Warhammer of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain in 1982, which initially didn't sell particularly well, but over time, in a few months, it did. And Penguin Books, the publishers of their Puffin brand, wanted more and more books, and that became not a distraction. It was amazing that we had suddenly best-selling authors on a global basis, published in over 30 countries, but we were having to do author tours in New Zealand and Australia and America and Africa and all over Europe and Canada, and it was just not sucking the life out of you, but it was putting huge constraints on time. So running Games Workshop during the day and writing books at night and going on these author tours was quite something.
Again, yeah, sounds like maybe a bit of a superhuman effort to be running it and writing and doing all this sort of stuff. It doesn't sound like you guys ever slept for maybe 10 years.
I think it's probably a fair point that we were, Yeah, I mean, I remember coming home often quite tired at 7 or 8 at night from workshop, and then starting writing Fighting Fancy game book till like 2 in the morning, and kind of rinse and repeat for months on end, because there's more and more pressure from Puffin, who wanted more and more books as they succeeded. I mean, Fighting Fancy was obviously quite a milestone in book publishing. The original idea came really out of a convention we used to hold Games Day, and there was an editor from Puffin called Geraldine Cook, who came to Games Day 79 and was bemused by how involved everybody was playing D&D and other role-playing games. And she asked Steve and I if we'd write a book about the hobby, and we said, well, let's write a book that allows you to experience that hobby. And she said, great idea, send in a synopsis. So we didn't really know what that would be, but we came up with a concept which we entitled The Magic Quest, which is a branching narrative book with a game system attached, with a kind of distilling the essence of a role-playing game into book format with multiple choices, and applying a combat system and 3 characteristics: skill, stamina, and luck, for the alter ego personalization of the player character. And she thought it was amazing, but it took her months to convince her senior management at Puffin to actually run with the idea. So the first one came out in 82, and so it's sold slowly until the word of mouth of Playgrounds and some help from being on BBC Radio 1 suddenly started to boom.
You mentioned that you'd written The Warlock of Firetop Mountain in 82. What was your sort of expectations for that? Did you think that would go on to be as successful as it was? And did you have ideas for sequels and a whole series, or was it really just an experiment at that point?
We had no idea how it was going to do, because there wasn't much enthusiasm coming out of Puffin at the time. It took Geraldine a year to convince senior management. In fact, the managing director of Penguin Books reportedly dismissed the idea and laughed so hard he banged his head on the table when told about it. Said no one's going to want an interactive book. Books are linear. What are you doing? But she fought our corner, and it did come out, as you know, in 82. But with low expectations. There was no marketing for it. I think they printed about 5,000 copies. So our own expectations were pretty low, but we still had an immense sense of pride when we walk into W.H. Smith and see it there on the shelf with the cover from Peter Andrew Jones. And I think, of course, art was a great help in getting Fighting Fancy noticed, at least, and then obviously enjoyed by the readers. And that was another argument we'd had with Puffin about the artist, because the books were being aimed at kind of 10, 11-year-old market. So being a children's imprint, they wanted a very safe cover, with a toadstool, little gnome sitting on there, and butterflies, a little sleepy frog nearby. And we wanted covers that threatened to rip the faces off the readers using our Games Workshop artists. But to their credit, that they let us do that. And we had some incredible art on our books. I mean, Ian McCaig is my favorite Fighting Fantasy artist. He did the covers of Forest of Doom, City of Thieves, Death Trap Dungeon, and Island of the Lizard King. And he went on to create Darth Maul for George Lucas, who's phenomenally talented. And the artwork by everybody was amazing. But the expectations were low, but of course, they were very successful despite the criticism in the media. I mean, when they first came out, the Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide saying, because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, you're just bound to be possessed by the devil. It was part of the satanic panic at the time around D&D. And the local vicar at the Penguin Books threatened to chain himself to the railings until they were banned. There were petitions sent in. At the same time, teachers were saying, hey, these are great for reluctant readers. They're great for critical thinking. They're really improving literacy. They're giving agencies to the readers, and they're forging their own destiny. And this is amazing. So there's a kind of a bit of disconnect with how it was being reported in the media and what was actually happening at ground level. But over time, I think everyone realized that they were entertaining and also people were learning at the same time. And they were huge success globally. Over 20 million copies sold in over 30 languages.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that sort of the educational aspect of it, because it does feel like there is a real benefit to that kind of thing. And some of the earliest attempts at doing that kind of interactive writing were actually like for textbooks. I wonder if you'd ever sort of thought about taking the fighting fantasy and using it for more specifically educational purposes. Was that ever on the cards or something that was thought about?
It was never on the cards, but clearly you realize the educational value and the learning that children in particular get from this empowerment through choice. Really giving them agency is very powerful. And we know that children are naturally curious and like making their own decisions, and Final Fantasy game books allow them to do that. So I'm all for games-based learning in schools and project-based, and I think that learning by doing, participating in learning gives you a much deeper understanding than just listening to the sage on the stage and teaching the test through memory recall. I think it's a bit outmoded these days.
Yeah, yeah, and the gamification of stuff is definitely become a sort of key factor in getting people to learn more and engage more with certain stuff. But over time, the fighting fantasy brand, I guess, really took off and just became this beast itself with 59 books published in that original run. I mean, and you wrote many of those. I mean, where were you sort of pulling ideas from in order to put together so many different stories?
Well, I was a huge science fiction book reader, huge comic reader, played Dungeons and Dragons for 7 years before I wrote the first Final Fantasy game book, or 6 years, and have a pretty vivid imagination and love luring people to their doom. And my objective in Final Fantasy game books is thinking terrible ways to make people suffer and die at the end of each choice, because kids like taking the scary route anyway, and they understand the difference between fantasy and reality, and they like the thrill of facing the dragon or down terrible pits and landing on poison spikes. It makes them laugh.
Is there any of the books that sort of still stay with you as a real favorite that you or anybody wrote from the original series?
Well, I guess that's a bit like asking me what's my favorite child, and I've got 4 kids. So I usually say there's 4 that are important to me. There's Warlock of Fire Top Mountain, because that was the first one, so it was an emotional thing. I wrote it with Steve. And then of my own, I think City of Thieves and Death Trap Dungeon have got to be up there. And then it's kind of between Forest of Doom and the one I wrote last year, actually, which I'm very fond of, Shadow of the Giants.
Yeah, great. And that because that was a return to the Fighting Fantasy range after a relatively sort of a bit of a break there, right? And they've been now published again by Scholastic, and there's a whole series of books. And I think Steve Jackson also wrote a new one to go with Shadow of the Giants as well, didn't he? Yeah. And what was it like coming back to sort of revisit and jump back into the world of Fighting Fantasy?
Well, it wasn't so much of a shock for me because I'd carried on writing. Didn't really stop. I mean, there was a gap from 95 to 2001 or something like that. But then I wrote Eye of the Dragon for Wizard Books, who took up the mantle after Puffin went away. And then I wrote Blood of the Zombies. And then when Scholastic took over in 2017, I gave them a new titles for that launch, which was Port of Peril. And that was followed by Assassins of Alancia. And then most recently, Shadow of the Giants, which came out in 22.
Right. And is it still the same? Do you still feel the sort of same energy and excitement when you sit down to start writing one?
The same excitement, perhaps not the same energy now, my ripe old age. But I still write them in exactly the same way, with the only difference. In the old days, I used to write with a fountain pen, and then my girlfriend would type them up, but I'd still do a manual flow charts. And I've never used software for the construction of the adventures. I mean, obviously the readers can't, I mean, the listeners can't see it, but this is like a a flow chart, which is like a computer flow chart with all the annotations of all the numbers and the pinch points, and to make sure I can balance it.
That's incredible. I mean, that must take just a lot of work, even on its own, just to document all of the different branching paths and sort of visualize the
Yeah, well,
story.
I don't have a preset dungeon layout. I have an idea for a story arc, but then it's very designed on the fly, and I'll think of something as we go, and then have to go back and place an item so you can find it for where you now have arrived or not. And then sometimes you get stuck, so you have to find a secret door to somehow get you back to where you need to be. So it's very much designed on the fly as my imagination takes hold.
Have there ever been any sort of nightmare scenarios where you've done most of the writing and then you're like, oh, actually, I need to shift everything forward by one and go and insert something much earlier?
You can kind of, it's a bit like, I imagine it's a bit like when you're painting a floor and you kind of paint yourself into a corner. Sometimes you think, why have I written this to get me into this situation? I've no idea I can get out of here. And then you spend a day trying to find some way to get out of it, which usually involves cheating, which you can do in a fantasy world. Oh, here's a secret door. Oh, here's a magic staircase that wasn't there half an hour ago.
The benefit of having wizards available to
Yeah,
use, yeah.
yeah.
So you'd started the Fighting Fantasy series, and so it was the early 80s. You were still producing new games through Games Workshop, and obviously Games Workshop was expanding and sort of growing, but you and Steve Jackson made the choice to step away from Games Workshop and sort of hand over the reins
Yeah.
to Bryan Ansell. What was that sort of decision-making process like, and how did it feel stepping away from this company that you'd built?
As you pointed out, it was pretty full on for a number of years. Running workshop during the day, writing fantasy and fighting fantasy game books at night, going on these author tours, and it was a lot. And you can only do that for so long. So in '86, we decided we needed a managing director to manage the group and bring the two groups together effectively. The two parts of the company, which is Games Workshop and Citadel, and the obvious candidate was Bryan Ansell. He proved himself in multiple ways as being the right person for the job. It also was core profit center in Citadel, and Warhammer was flying now, and he just, we'd known him since '78 and worked well with him for a number of years. So we took more of a backseat role as directors then, so we could focus more on our own sanity in writing fighting fantasy game books, but still very much involved in the strategy of Workshop until 1991, when there were, by that time, 4 shareholders: Bryan Ansell, Keith Pinfold, the financial director, Steve Jackson, and myself. We all sold out in a management buyout to Tom Kirby with a private equity-based management buyout. And then ultimately, Workshop was put on the London Stock Exchange a couple of years later and became the incredible successful beast that it is today. Value not far short of £4 billion at the London Stock Exchange, and that's an amazing thing that's happened, and I'm very proud that was part of the initial journey, because it's been a great British success story.
Absolutely, yeah, and continues to change and evolve over time, and sort of, yeah, you definitely planted those seeds that would grow into this mighty oak. But same with Fighting Fantasy, which continues now as well, and lots of other stuff. And you've had a hand in loads of other initiatives over the years as well.
Yeah, well, another one of the reasons that we just agreed to selling out is that I'd seen video games coming along, and I was eager to get into video games as well as tabletop games. And I designed a launch product in 1984 for a startup called Domark. Death Trap Dungeon was #1 in the best-selling kids charts, and the founders of Domark came to me and said, would I design their launch product, which was Eureka. Was published on Spectrum and Commodore 64. And when I sold out of Workshop in '91, I joined Domark and invested in it, became vice chairman, and realized it was hugely undercapitalized at the 16-bit mark, was about to fall off the edge of cliff. And what am I doing now? So we decided to merge 4 companies to create a new company called IDOS, which we floated on the London Stock Exchange in 1995. And I was appointed executive chairman to run the company. And our big breakthrough came in March 96 when we acquired the only other public company in the space, Centre Gold. And with Centre Gold came a development studio in Derby called Core Design. And with Core Design came Lara, Croft, Tomb Raider.
Which went on to obviously spawn its own mighty
so
oak.
we when I first saw Lara Croft, I mean, you could say in a very corny way it was love at first sight. So we bought the company and launched Tomb Raider in October 96. I think we had 100,000 units in the budget, and over time sold over 7 million units of Tomb Raider 1, and it became another major franchise and an amazing success story in itself. But ultimately, Square Enix of Japan bought IDOS, and so I left the company in can't remember it was now, 2009, 10, 11, one of those years, and started another career as an angel investor and opening my own school and working with government around digital skills for the future. But that is, of course, another story. Let's get back to the games.
I mean, did you find any similarities in the sort of early days of video game as an industry versus the sort of tabletop game space, or was it a just completely different animal?
Well, difference obviously in that one is analog and one is digital, and also the teams required to make video games quickly became large, and whereas a board game is one person or a small group of people designing board games, and the miniatures, it's all individuals designing those, so you have a kind of greater visibility of what you're trying to create in the physical sense, whereas in video games, it's obviously it's an ethereal process, writing millions of lines of code, and you don't really have great visibility until you're quite far down the development path. So it's harder to see whether or not your game is going to be enjoyable or not. Yeah, so it's harder to playtest than it is with a board game, role-playing game, or just using miniatures. So there's a different mindset, and of course, it's a combination of art and technology. They have to have the game engine that runs the enjoyment that sits on top of that. So it's a different process, a whole different skill set. And I can't code a line, so reliant on highly skilled software engineers, artists, and animators, and a whole bunch of disparate skills that collectively combine to create this amazing interactive entertainment proposition, which are video games. But it's I love all forms of gaming. It doesn't really, I'm kind of platform agnostic, so I just enjoyed the entertainment and the joining up of people playing happily together and hanging out together. Is whether it's tabletop games, board games, video games, it's that joined up fun which does it for me.
I believe you still have a long running gaming group that meets up with Steve Jackson and others.
Yes, well, of course, I've been running the Games Night Club since 1986, and we have we had 6 members, and we're now down to 5.
All right.
Attrition over years, and as secretary of the Games Night Club, I have published 642 newsletters to a circulation of 1/6, but now tragically down to 5 readers of the Games Night Club newsletter, which is kind of a spoof of a gentleman's club. We play board games once a week. With Steve Jackson and Peter Molyneux, one of the most famous video games designers in the UK, and a few others who are not in the games industry. And after every game, we have a points total, and at the end of the year, the winner gets the trophy, which gets engraved.
What games come onto the table for you guys to play?
Well, we're too old now, and minds are gone to be able to play the kind of spreadsheet manager games that seem to be so popular these days, that kind of what we just call brain ache and too much like work. So our level is more like Ticket to Ride, Seven Wonders, Small World, Splendor. What else do we like? Not Jamaica. Seven Wonders, Century Spice Road. Did I mention that?
Right.
Kind of mid-tier stuff where there's some good player interaction, but lasting no longer than an hour.
Sure. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's you kind of fall asleep.
Do you ever want to bring out any of the classics like the Judge Dredd or the Legend of Zagor or anything like that?
Absolutely not. No, we do occasionally. It's just that so many new games to play. I mean, at Essen, there's usually over 1,000 new games coming
Hmm.
out. I've got 1,500 games in this room and probably only played 2/3 of them. So there's so many new games we want to play ahead of the games of the past.
Yeah, it's always the challenge, isn't it? There's always something new and exciting that takes
Yeah.
your fancy.
So recently we've been playing Heat and Challenges, two new games that have come out recently, and really enjoying those.
Right. Oh, great. And you said, obviously, you released Shadow of the Giants last year for Fighter Fantasy. You released Dice Men recently, your
Yeah.
sort of biography of the early days of Games Workshop. Are you working on any other books at the moment? Is there anything else in the future that's going to find its way onto the bookshelf?
Every time I finish a book, I say, right, that's it, no more. And then about a month later, I'm thinking, oh, I've got an idea for a game book. And that I try and kind of get rid of it. And then some people say cheekily, oh, do you know it's the 40th anniversary of Death Trap Dungeon next year? Of course I know it's the 40th anniversary. I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And oh God, and more challenges. But Dice Man was a long old haul. I think I was probably about 4 years late with it. And it just grew and grew. And the more I wrote, the more I wanted to find out more, because I couldn't remember everything. And then sourcing all the material and photos and images, and it just kind of grew its own life. But I'm delighted that's been a successful book. You know, the Origin Story Workshop, more of a personal memoir than a business book, and kind of all the trials and tribulations. So really enjoyed doing that. And it's now been signed up in Japan and Italy, and it's just been released in France, and so it's going well. I've been doing a few back on the author tours again, and I've been to 5 countries in the last month. So that's been good fun. But I'm currently writing with Jonathan Green, a book entitled Magic Realm, which you can, again, same as published by Unbound. So it's a crowdfunding platform for books. And that's about the art and artists of fighting fantasy, because we all know that how art plays such an important role in fighting fantasy. And so we're going to celebrate that in a book. So that'll be coming out probably next year, but you can still pledge if you want to on unbound.com. And there's that. And of course, I'm tinkering around with another fighting fantasy game book. I can't say I'm not, but I haven't officially announced it. So you might think that I possibly comment.
Yeah. That sounds like, we can at least live in hope then in that case. We might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, you might. And it's Fighting Fantasy Fest 5 next year in September. So of course we have to have something for release for that.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I'm very excited about it. Well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and sharing some of your reflections from an incredible career. So thank you so much for coming along.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I am really grateful to Sir Ian for taking the time to talk to me about his experiences founding Games Workshop and a lifetime of building up the games industry. It was an amazing opportunity and I really appreciate it. Sir Ian also does a load of really interesting philanthropic work, which I've included a link to in the description below if you want to check that out. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to support my work in documenting the greatest games ever made and speaking to the legends that made them, then why not check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, or just join my Discord. I've included links to all of those in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks again to Sir Ian Livingstone. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.